They didn't forget the Moors, they buried them. Because you don't accidentally leave out 700 years of rule. You don't oops your way past the fact that black Muslim Africans governed large parts of Europe longer than the United States has existed. You don't just miss that in the curriculum. That kind of absence is intentional. Ask yourself something simple. If the Moors were insignificant, why hide them? History doesn't work that way. Losers get erased, threats get minimized, and the Moors were both powerful and inconvenient. From 711 to 1492, large portions of Europe, especially the Iberian Peninsula, were under Moorish rule. Not raids, not brief occupations, governance, cities, law, education, infrastructure. 7 centuries of influence, stability, and intellectual dominance. Yet in school, you might get a sentence, a footnote, maybe a vague reference to Muslim invaders who were eventually pushed out so Europe could become itself. That framing alone is a lie, because when the Moors arrived, Europe wasn't leading anything. No Renaissance, no scientific revolution, no universities to brag about. Most of the continent was fragmented, illiterate, and locked into feudal systems that kept knowledge in the hands of a few. Then the Moors show up, and suddenly Europe starts changing. Cities like Cordoba, Seville, Granada, and Toledo become centers of learning. Libraries holding hundreds of thousands of books when the rest of Europe could barely muster a few dozen. Street lighting, running water, advanced agriculture, medicine, mathematics, philosophy. This wasn't Europe teaching the Moors, it was the other way around. And here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. The Moors were not some abstract Muslim force detached from Africa. They were Africans, black and brown people from North and West Africa. Scholars, administrators, architects, engineers. People whose presence contradicted the later idea that Africa had nothing to offer Europe but labor. That contradiction couldn't stand. So the story had to be reframed. Over time, the Moors were recast as racially ambiguous. Arab, Berber, Mediterranean. Anything that softened the African connection. Art was altered. Descriptions were diluted. Paintings showed lighter skin. Textbooks emphasized religion over race because religion can be debated. Race is harder to dodge, and the longer Europe leaned on the idea of its own superiority, the more dangerous the truth about the Moors became. You can't claim civilizational destiny if your enlightenment came from people you later colonized. So instead of teaching Moorish rule as a foundational chapter of European history, it gets treated like an interruption, a detour, a problem that had to be solved. That's why the reconquista is celebrated, not as a political shift, but as a moral victory, the reclaiming of Europe from African rule. Notice the language, reclaimed, as if it was always meant to belong to someone else, as if 7 centuries of governance didn't count, as if Moorish Europe wasn't Europe, but it was, and it shaped everything that followed. European universities were modeled on Moorish institutions. Greek philosophy re-entered Europe through Arabic translations preserved by Moorish scholars. Algebra, chemistry, optics, medicine, all transmitted through Moorish Spain. Europe didn't rediscover knowledge on its own. It received it, and receipts exist. Latin texts crediting Arabic sources. European scholars traveling south to study. Churches built over former mosques. Cities literally standing on Moorish foundations. This isn't speculation, it's documented. So why isn't it taught plainly? Because teaching it plainly breaks the myth. The myth that Europe rose alone, the myth that Africa contributed nothing but bodies, the myth that blackness and brilliance don't coexist. The Moors destroy all three. That's why their story is compressed, blurred, and pushed aside. Not denied outright, that would raise questions, but reduced enough to feel irrelevant. Yet 700 years is not irrelevant. 700 years is a civilization, and civilizations leave fingerprints in language, architecture, music, science, law, even in European royalty, whose bloodlines quietly absorbed Moorish ancestry while publicly rejecting it. That's the contradiction at the heart of this silence. Europe learned from the Moors, benefited from them, built on their systems, then erased them to claim sole ownership of progress. That erasure wasn't clean, it left gaps, and gaps make people curious. Which brings us to the real starting point of this story, because before we talk about how the Moors ruled Europe, we have to confront something more uncomfortable. Who exactly were the Moors, really, before history bleached them out of the picture? Let's clear the fog immediately. Moor was never a religion. It was never a mystery race. It was never code for not European. The Moors were Africans, full stop. The term itself comes from Moorish, people from Mauritania, a Roman name for regions of North and West Africa, modern Morocco, Algeria, parts of Mali and beyond, dark-skinned, brown-skinned, black, the same people Europe would later colonize, but when history is retold, that clarity disappears. Suddenly, the Moors become Arabs, or Berbers, or just Muslims, as if faith erases phenotype. That confusion isn't accidental, it's useful, because once you blur who the Moors were, you weaken what they represent, African power on European soil. Contemporary Europeans didn't misunderstand this. They described Moors plainly: dark faces, curly hair, African features. Medieval art showed it clearly too, before later generations started repainting and revising. The Moors didn't sneak into Europe either. They entered openly, militarily, strategically, and then they stayed. Not as occupiers looting resources, but as governors building systems, courts, schools, cities designed for long-term living. That matters, because conquest can be dismissed, civilization can't. Under Moorish rule, Al-Andalus wasn't a backwater. It was the most advanced region in Europe, and advancement wasn't limited to elites. Public baths, street lighting, sanitation, agriculture that fed cities consistently. These weren't accidents. They were African knowledge systems applied at scale. And Europe noticed. Christian scholars crossed borders to study in Moorish cities. They learned Arabic to access books. They copied methods, translated texts, imported ideas. Europe wasn't ashamed then. The shame came later. It came when power shifted, when Europe began expanding outward and needed a new story about itself, a story where it was always meant to lead, always destined to dominate. African teachers complicated that story, so identity was rewritten. The Moors were slowly detached from Africa and folded into a vague Islamic world. Their blackness was minimized, their African origin treated as incidental. But look at the geography. Most Moorish leadership came from Africa, not Arabia. Troops crossed from the Maghreb. Dynasties like the Almoravids and Almohads rose directly out of African political systems. This wasn't foreign ideology parachuting in. It was African governance extending north, and Europe felt the difference. That's why Moorish rule wasn't immediately overthrown. It took centuries. Not because Europeans didn't want control, but because the Moorish system worked. Stability is hard to overthrow, which is why, even during periods of conflict, Christian kingdoms copied Moorish practices instead of rejecting them. Architecture, accounting, diplomacy, even fashion. You don't copy what you consider inferior. That contradiction sits at the heart of the erasure. Europe needed Moorish knowledge, but not Moorish identity. So the people became shadows while their contributions stayed in use. That's how erasure works at its most efficient. You keep the product and delete the producer. And once you understand who the Moors really were, Africans governing Europe, the next question becomes unavoidable. How did they manage to rule for 7 centuries without collapsing? Because that kind of longevity doesn't come from force alone, it comes from systems. And those systems are exactly what history doesn't want you examining too closely. 700 years doesn't happen by accident. Empires built on brute force burn out fast. The Moors didn't last in Europe because of constant war. They lasted because they built a system people could live under. That's the part usually skipped. Moorish rule in Al-Andalus worked because it was organized, educated, and adaptable. Cities were planned, not improvised. Roads connected regions. Water systems turned dry land into farmland. Food security meant fewer revolts. Stability buys time, and time builds legitimacy. The Moors understood administration. Courts operated on written law, not arbitrary violence. Judges were trained. Contracts mattered. Trade was protected. Merchants moved freely across regions. That created economic gravity. People don't rebel against systems that make life better. But the real glue was knowledge. Education wasn't restricted to elites. Libraries were public. Books were copied at scale. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, not treated as luxuries, but necessities of governance. That's why Al-Andalus became Europe's intellectual magnet. Christian and Jewish scholars studied under Moorish teachers, not as equals, as students. Translators moved Arabic texts into Latin. Ideas crossed borders faster than armies ever could. This is how Europe learned, not by conquest, by attendance. And the Moors didn't rule by erasing others either. Religious communities governed their own affairs. Taxes existed, but order existed too. Compared to feudal Europe, this felt advanced, even humane. That contrast embarrassed later historians because it shattered the myth of inevitable European progress, which is why Moorish success had to be framed as temporary, an anomaly, a fluke. But again, 7 centuries. That's not temporary. What really sustained Moorish rule was synthesis. African governance blended with Mediterranean trade networks and Islamic scholarship. It wasn't rigid, it evolved. Rigid systems break, adaptive systems last, and Europe absorbed that lesson quietly. Universities formed based on Moorish models. Cities expanded using Moorish infrastructure. Even royal courts adopted administrative techniques developed under African leadership. Yet when the balance of power shifted, gratitude vanished. Europe didn't just want the systems, it wanted the credit. So Moorish rule was rebranded as occupation. Its successes reclassified as borrowed from Greece or Rome. African influence got edited out of the lineage. This is where the long-term strategy appears. You don't deny the Moors existed. You deny they mattered. You shrink their role. You isolate their achievements. You detach them from Africa. And then you teach Europe's rise as self-generated. But facts resist compression. The more scholars dig, the more Moorish fingerprints appear in law codes, architecture, medical texts, navigation methods. This is why the Moors remain dangerous to myth-making. They proved that African systems could govern Europe effectively, that black leadership wasn't chaos, it was order. That truth destabilizes every later justification for colonization, which leads directly to the backlash. Because when Europe began reclaiming territory, the conflict wasn't just military, it was psychological, cultural, narrative-driven. They didn't just want land back, they wanted the story back. And to do that, the Moors had to be transformed from rulers into invaders. That transformation is where the real distortion begins. So the next question isn't how the Moors ruled, it's how Europe erased 7 centuries of African governance and convinced the world it never really counted. The shift didn't happen overnight. It happened when power changed hands. Once Christian kingdoms began reclaiming territory, they didn't just remove Moorish rulers, they removed memory. Mosques were converted, Arabic texts were burned or rebranded, African scholars were pushed out, killed, or silenced. Then the story was rewritten. Moorish rule stopped being called governance and started being called occupation. 7 centuries of stability were reframed as a temporary invasion. Europe heroically survived. That language matters because occupation suggests illegitimacy. It suggests Europe was always meant to rule itself, even if it couldn't for hundreds of years. So, history was retrofitted to match the outcome. African rulers became outsiders. African systems became borrowed. African success became an interruption, and race was quietly edited. Medieval art originally depicted Moors as dark-skinned Africans. Later reproductions lightened them. Textbooks stopped showing their faces at all. Moor became a word detached from blackness because Europe couldn't reconcile 2 ideas at once, that it rose to power and that Africans once ruled it well, so one had to go. And it wasn't European pride. This is where the Reconquista became sacred, not just a military campaign, but a moral cleansing, a way to purify Europe's origin story. to reset the narrative clock. 1492 wasn't just about Columbus, it was about closure, the end of African rule, the beginning of European expansion, the rewriting of who belonged at the center of history. From that point on, Moorish contributions were absorbed without attribution. Algebra stayed, architecture stayed, medicine stayed, navigation stayed. The people didn't. That's the pattern you should recognize. Europe didn't reject Moorish civilization. It inherited it, then disowned the source. And once that disowning became institutional, it turned into curriculum. Generations grew up learning about castles, crusades, and kings without ever hearing who built the systems underneath them. 700 years reduced to silence. That silence wasn't neutral, it was strategic. Because if you admit the Moors ruled Europe successfully, you have to explain why African governance disappeared and whether it was ever inferior in the first place. That question threatens too much. So instead, Europe told a cleaner story, and the world repeated it, which leaves us with the uncomfortable pivot point. If the Moors were erased after losing power, what happened to the African influence that survived inside Europe anyway? Erasing rulers is easy. Erasing systems is harder, because even after the Moors were expelled, Europe kept running on African infrastructure. Not metaphorically, literally. Universities didn't appear out of nowhere. The first European universities copied the Moorish model: structured curricula, degrees, examinations, libraries. Before Moorish Spain, Europe had monasteries. After Moorish Spain, it had universities. That's not evolution. That's adoption. Hospitals followed the same path. Moorish cities had public hospitals with wards, pharmacies, surgical tools, and trained physicians. Europe didn't. After contact, suddenly it did. Same layouts, same methods, different names. Mathematics is even clearer. Europe didn't invent algebra. The word itself is Arabic. Algorithms, also Arabic. Trigonometry tables used by European navigators came straight from Moorish scholars. Without them, there is no age of exploration, which means this needs to be said plainly. Europe didn't rise after the Moors. Europe rose because of them. But here's the trick they pulled. They separated knowledge from people. Once the Moors were gone, their contributions were stripped of origin. Textbooks said European scholars rediscovered ancient knowledge, as if Africans hadn't preserved, expanded, and applied it for centuries. Rediscovered is a convenient word. It erases the bridge, because admitting Africa was the bridge between the ancient world and modern Europe breaks the myth of European self-creation. So the African code stayed hidden in plain sight. Every cathedral using Moorish geometry, every medical text copied from Arabic originals, every map built on African navigation. Europe kept the tools, then taught the world they invented them. And here's the part most people miss. This wasn't ignorance, it was policy. As racial hierarchy hardened in the modern era, Europe could not allow Africans to be seen as intellectual ancestors. That would collapse the logic of domination. So the Moors had to disappear twice, first politically, then intellectually. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable question yet. If African systems powered Europe's rise, why was Africa itself later portrayed as incapable of civilization at all? Here's the contradiction Europe couldn't survive. You can't justify conquering a continent whose ideas already built your world, so Africa's image had to be destroyed after its knowledge was taken. Once Europe absorbed Moorish science, medicine, architecture, and navigation, it pivoted. The narrative flipped. Africa was no longer the source. It became the void. Maps shrank Africa. Texts erased its cities. Explorers discovered places that had already existed for centuries. Timbuktu went from global university center to desert myth. Great Zimbabwe became an accident. Benin's bronzes were called impossible because admitting African sophistication would expose the lie. So Europe introduced a new story. Progress flows north. Civilization moves west. Africa waits. That framework wasn't accidental. It was required. The moment Africans were cast as primitive, everything Europe had taken could be rebranded as European genius. Moorish knowledge stopped being African and became Western foundations. This is where race science enters: skulls, charts, hierarchies, fake measurements dressed as objectivity. Scholars argued Africans were biologically incapable of higher thought, while teaching from African textbooks. That hypocrisy didn't bother them. Power never needs consistency, it needs obedience. And the lie worked because it was everywhere: schools, churches, museums, maps, even language. Dark Ages ended when Europe rose, not when Africa fell. Africa was framed as history's shadow, so Europe could stand in the light. But shadows only exist because something blocks the sun, which leads to the final pressure point. If Europe required Africa to be forgotten in order to rule the world, what happens when that memory comes back? This wasn't academic drift, it was psychological engineering. When you erase African rule in Europe, you're not just hiding the past, you're shaping expectations. You're teaching the world who is allowed to lead, innovate, and govern. That's the real function of the silence, because once the Moors were removed from the story, black authority became unthinkable, not debated, unimaginable. Europe didn't just win territory, it won narrative control. And narrative control determines legitimacy. If Africans never ruled Europe, then European dominance feels natural, inevitable, deserved. That belief system doesn't require chains or armies to maintain itself. It lives in minds. That's why this isn't taught, not because the evidence is weak, but because the implications are strong, teaching 7 centuries of African governance forces uncomfortable admissions. Europe wasn't always in charge. Black leadership wasn't marginal. Modern Western civilization is not racially isolated. That collapses too many myths at once. So instead, the Moors are reduced to footnotes, or stripped of blackness, or framed as exotic outsiders with no lasting impact. Anything but rulers, anything but architects. And the result is generational amnesia. People don't question why Europe needed centuries of African rule to stabilize. They don't ask why Europe's Renaissance followed Moorish decline. They don't ask why African knowledge disappears the moment Europe rises. Silence does that work, which leaves one final question hanging. If history was edited this aggressively, what other truths were removed right alongside the Moors? And more importantly, who benefits from you never asking that question? The Moors didn't just disappear. They were pushed out, systematically. And once the power shifted, the cleanup began. Libraries burned, Arabic texts destroyed, scholars expelled or forced to convert, mosques rebranded as churches, street names changed, family records erased. This wasn't conquest alone. This was historical laundering, because Europe didn't want evidence of who taught them. Think about it. If the Moors were insignificant, why erase their paper trail? Why outlaw Arabic? Why ban African dress? Why criminalize Moorish customs? You don't destroy what doesn't threaten you. Spain called it the reconquista. Sounds heroic. But in reality, it was reclamation of narrative more than land. They weren't just taking cities back. They were taking credit. And they moved fast. Within decades, Europe rebranded Moorish achievements as European progress. Irrigation systems became Spanish innovations. Universities became Christian institutions. Medical knowledge lost its African fingerprints. The transfer was seamless, because most people never saw the originals. And here's the cold part. Europe didn't just remove the Moors from power, it redefined what civilized looked like afterward. African presence became synonymous with chaos. European rule became synonymous with order. That contrast wasn't accidental. It justified everything that came next. Because once Africa was reframed as incapable of governance, exploitation could be sold as stewardship. Control could be sold as guidance. Erasure could be sold as correction. The Moors weren't just removed from Europe. They were removed to make room for a new story, one where black excellence had no precedent. And that story spread. Textbooks, art, maps, churches, all reinforcing the same quiet message. Africans don't rule empires. They don't build systems. They don't define eras, except they did, for 700 years. So ask yourself, if Europe had to burn books, ban languages, and rewrite cities to forget the Moors, How solid was the story they replaced it with? Here's where the cover story cracks. Because even after the burnings, the bans, the rebranding, too much survived. You can scrape names off buildings. You can repaint faces in books, but systems don't lie. Europe's sudden leap didn't come from nowhere. Hospitals appeared with structured wards and sanitation, straight out of Moorish medical manuals. Universities adopted degree systems, peer review, and syllabi modeled after Andalusian institutions. Algebra, algorithms, and zero entered Europe through Arabic texts translated from African scholars working under Moorish rule. This wasn't coincidence, it was inheritance. Look at the architecture: horseshoe arches, courtyards with running water, geometric tiling based on advanced mathematics. These aren't styles, they're signatures. And they didn't originate in Paris or Rome. They came from black-led North African civilizations that mastered engineering while Europe was still suspicious of bathing. Even Europe's language snitched. Words like algebra, admiral, tariff, sugar, cotton, chemistry, all Arabic roots. You don't absorb that much vocabulary from people who supposedly didn't matter. And then there's the art. Early European paintings quietly show black nobles, black knights, black scholars standing shoulder to shoulder with white clergy. Not servants, not background figures, central, respected, powerful. Later versions erase them. That's not evolution, that's editing. Because once race became the organizing principle of power, the past had to be adjusted to match the present. Europe couldn't rise as racially superior while standing on African shoulders, so the Moors had to shrink, not disappear completely. That would raise questions, just enough to seem irrelevant. But the math doesn't lie, the infrastructure doesn't lie, the timelines don't lie. Civilizations don't leap forward without teachers. Europe had teachers. They just weren't white. And here's the pressure point. If the Moors weren't a minor footnote, if they were foundational, then modern Europe isn't purely European at all. It's African influenced at its core. That realization destabilizes everything. Which is why the next move wasn't denial, it was distraction. So the question becomes, once they couldn't erase the evidence, how did they convince the world to stop looking for it? They didn't argue the evidence, they buried it under noise. Once outright erasure stopped working, the strategy shifted to confusion, overcomplication, academic fog. They turned clear history into a debate maze so exhausting most people walked away. Suddenly, everything was complex, dates blurred, terms got slippery, definitions expanded until nothing meant anything. The Moors weren't African. They were culturally ambiguous. They weren't black. They were Mediterranean. They didn't rule. They influenced. That language matters because influence sounds optional. Rule sounds undeniable. So textbooks focused on Christian kings, not Moorish administrators. They spotlighted battles, not governance. Collapse, not construction. The Moors became a temporary inconvenience instead of a ruling class. And here's the psychological trick. They separated African identity from intelligence. You were taught Africa equals raw resources, not refined systems. Rhythm, not reason. Spirit, not science. That framing makes it hard to even imagine Africans running Europe, no matter how much proof exists. So people stop asking. They assume the silence means insignificance. That's how you hide something massive without locking it away. You exhaust curiosity. And once curiosity dies, the lie doesn't need protection anymore. But the silence still leaks, because if the Moors were truly irrelevant, Europe wouldn't still be standing on their foundations, the start universities, the legal frameworks, the urban planning. Those didn't vanish. They just stopped crediting their source, which leads to the uncomfortable truth they hope you never say out loud. If Europe's rise depended on African rule, what does that say about who really carried civilization forward? And why does that idea still make institutions nervous today? Because this isn't about the past. It's about legitimacy right now. If Africans ruled Europe competently for centuries, then modern racial hierarchies collapse. Not emotionally, structurally. The idea that leadership, governance, and intellect are naturally European stops making sense. That's dangerous, Because modern power still leans on historical justification. Nations don't just rule, they inherit. They trace authority backward. Rome, Greece, Enlightenment, progress. That lineage is used to explain why some countries dominate and others don't. Now imagine inserting 7 centuries of African rule into that bloodline. It breaks it. Suddenly, Europe didn't rise alone. Suddenly, Africa isn't peripheral. Suddenly, Black history isn't reactive. It's foundational. That's why this topic never stays neutral, because once you accept Moorish rule as real and African, you have to reevaluate everything built after it: colonial logic, racial science, even modern immigration narratives. Who's the outsider if Africans once governed Europe? That question flips the script too hard, so institutions play defense, not loudly, quietly, by omission, by soft language, by pretending the Moors were a moment instead of a millennium-scale force. And here's the key. This isn't ignorance, it's risk management, because teaching this fully doesn't just empower Black people. It destabilizes a story the modern world still depends on. So the silence remains, but silence isn't truth, it's strategy. And strategies only exist when there's something worth hiding. So ask yourself, if this history was harmless, why does it still feel forbidden to say it plainly? Here's the part they didn't calculate. Erasure only works when people agree to forget, and that agreement is breaking, because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. African rule gets minimized everywhere it appears, not debated. Minimized. That's not coincidence. That's policy disguised as scholarship. Look at how fast the tone changes when the Moors are described as Black. Suddenly the conversation tightens. Footnotes multiply. Certainty evaporates. The same evidence that's clear in every other context becomes controversial. That's not academic caution, that's containment. Because acknowledging African authority in Europe doesn't just rewrite textbooks, it rewires identity. It gives Black people precedent, proof, memory. And memory is dangerous when power depends on amnesia. That's why they don't outright forbid this history. They dilute it. They let it exist, just quietly enough to never activate pride, never inspire comparison, never make you ask why your ancestors are always shown at the margins when the evidence puts them at the center. But here's the reality. You don't rule a continent for 700 years by accident. You don't run courts, universities, economies, and cities without competence. You don't teach the world science and then magically forget it overnight. The Moors weren't a side chapter. They were the chapter Europe needed and then buried. So now the responsibility shifts, not to institutions, not to textbooks, to you. Because once you know this, repeating the silence becomes a choice. And the real question is no longer why wasn't this taught? It's this. Now that you see it, what are you going to do with the truth they hoped you'd never claim? This isn't about bragging rights. It's about orientation. When you understand that Africans ruled Europe, competence stops feeling foreign. Intelligence stops feeling conditional. Leadership stops feeling like something you have to prove twice as hard. History becomes a mirror instead of a wall. That's why this matters now, because modern narratives still frame Black success as an exception, an anomaly, a breakthrough. But ruling Europe for centuries is not an anomaly. It's a pattern interrupted, and patterns change how people move. You don't walk the same when you know your ancestors governed courts instead of just surviving them. You don't negotiate the same when you know your lineage includes lawmakers, scientists, and administrators, not just labor. That confidence isn't arrogance, it's calibration. And here's the part that scares institutions the most. Reclaimed history produces standards. Once you know what Africans built before, you start asking why systems today feel smaller, why education feels narrower, why governance feels hostile instead of communal. Memory raises expectations, and raised expectations threaten systems built on lowered self-image. So reclaiming Moorish history isn't about the past. It's about refusing to accept reduced versions of yourself in the present, which leads to the final tension. If knowing this changes how you see yourself, imagine what fully teaching it would do to the world. And that's the pressure point they've been avoiding all along. Here's the last trick they pulled, and it's the slickest one. They didn't deny Moorish rule outright, they compressed it. 700 years got flattened into a brief period. Multiple generations of governance turned into a phase. An era became an episode, because time matters. If the Moors ruled Europe briefly, then their impact feels accidental. If they ruled for centuries, then their influence becomes structural. And Europe cannot afford that second interpretation. So watch how the language works. Textbooks say, the Moors occupied parts of Spain. Occupied, temporary, unstable. Never ruled, never governed, never systematized. But occupation doesn't build universities. Occupation doesn't engineer irrigation networks still used today. Occupation doesn't produce legal codes, medical standards, and global trade routes. Rule does, and the timeline proves it, from 711 to 1492. That's not a moment. That's longer than the United States has existed. Twice. Imagine someone calling America a temporary influence on the world. It sounds ridiculous. That's how deep the distortion runs. Because when you shrink time, you shrink responsibility. You shrink credit. You shrink legacy. And once legacy is small enough, it can be ignored. This is why the Moors are always discussed at the edges of chapters. Never the backbone, never the center of gravity. Europe's rise is treated like a miracle. Moorish rule is treated like a footnote, but miracles don't last 700 years. Systems do. And systems require intelligence, administration, discipline, and vision. All things Africans are never supposed to have had, according to the story. So the timeline had to be cut down, because a long African timeline in Europe raises dangerous questions. Why did European cities decline after Moorish expulsion? Why did sanitation collapse? Why did knowledge flow backward instead of forward? Those questions are inconvenient. They suggest regression, not progress. They suggest Europe lost something. They suggest Africa wasn't catching up later. It was already ahead. That flips the entire civilizational hierarchy. So instead of confronting that, institutions chose a safer option. They made the Moors feel fleeting. And here's the psychological effect. If African excellence only appears briefly, it feels abnormal. If it lasts centuries, it feels natural. That's the real reason the timeline was attacked, because time creates legitimacy. 700 years says, this worked, this was stable, this was real. And stability is the one thing racist frameworks can't explain away. You can dismiss a genius. You can dismiss a hero. You can't dismiss a civilization that governed another civilization longer than most modern nations have existed. So they shrank it. And then they waited. Because once something feels distant and small enough, people stop defending it. They stop questioning it. They stop claiming it. Which brings us to the moment we're in now. The compression is failing. More people are noticing the gaps. The timelines don't add up. The architecture doesn't match the narrative. The knowledge transfer is too obvious. And once you stretch the timeline back to its real size, the lie can't hold its shape anymore. Because the Moors weren't a flash. They were an era. And Europe didn't just encounter them. Europe was run by them. So the final question isn't whether this history was hidden. It's this. If they had to shrink 700 years just to keep the story believable, what happens when people finally let the timeline breathe again? Here's how they closed the loop. They didn't just shrink Moorish rule. They rebranded its aftermath. Enter the Renaissance, a rebirth of Europe, as if knowledge suddenly appeared out of thin air. But rebirth implies death first. So ask the obvious question, what died? Because Europe didn't rise from nothing, it rose from inheritance. The Renaissance begins almost immediately after Moorish expulsion. Same cities, same infrastructure, same libraries, just translated, renamed, and reissued. Greek texts didn't magically resurface. They were preserved, copied, and taught under Moorish rule, in Arabic, by African scholars. Europe didn't rediscover knowledge, it received it. But calling it a transfer gives credit. Calling it a rebirth gives ownership. That's the trick. Once Moorish teachers were gone, Europe crowned itself the author. Same math, same medicine. New signatures, Leonardo, Galileo, Copernicus. brilliant minds, but working inside systems that already existed. The Renaissance wasn't creation, it was continuation, and continuation doesn't fit a supremacy narrative. So Africa had to be removed from the origin story. This is why the Renaissance is framed as European genius awakening after dark ages. Dark for who? Because while Europe slept, African-led societies were teaching the world. The darkness wasn't universal, it was local, but renaming the era shifts responsibility. Europe becomes the hero. Africa becomes irrelevant. The Moors fade out right on cue. That's not history. That's narrative succession. And once Europe positioned itself as the sole source of modernity, everything that followed, empire, expansion, domination, felt justified. Because how can you conquer people if you admit they already taught you? You can't. So the Renaissance became the cover story, a clean break, a fresh start, a way to inherit without acknowledging the teacher. But inheritance always leaves fingerprints, which leads to the last tension. If Europe's golden age was built on African scaffolding, why are we still pretending the foundation doesn't matter? This lie didn't just rewrite Europe, it rewired Black identity. Because when you remove African authority from global history, you don't just hide facts, you shape self-perception. You teach generations to see themselves as late arrivals instead of originators. That's the damage. When Black people are shown only at the margins of history, success feels borrowed, temporary, conditional. Even when it's earned, it feels like an exception. That wasn't accidental. A people who remember governance don't accept domination easily. A people who remember systems don't settle for scraps. A people who remember legacy demand continuity. So the memory had to go. And once it did, the psychological effect set in. Europe becomes the default standard. Africa becomes the deviation. Excellence feels European. Struggle feels African. That framing still runs quietly today. You see it in who is assumed competent, who is assumed neutral, who is assumed behind. All of it traces back to historical editing. Because if the Moors ruled Europe successfully, then Black leadership is not experimental. It's proven. And proven competence dismantles every modern excuse used to exclude. That's why this history never sits still. It keeps resurfacing. Because identity doesn't erase cleanly. Memory resists deletion. Truth leaks. And when people reconnect with this past, something shifts. Confidence stops being performative. Pride stops needing permission. Ambition stops apologizing. Not because of fantasy, but because of precedent. This is what institutions underestimated. You can distort history, but you can't control how people feel once they recognize themselves in it. Which brings us to the breaking point. If forgetting was the weapon, remembering is the counterstrike, and the final question becomes unavoidable. What happens when enough people stop accepting a history that was designed to make them feel small? Here's what gets missed. The Moors didn't lose Europe because they were weak. They lost it because power shifted, politically, religiously, economically, and when that happened, resistance didn't end. It changed form. After expulsion, Africans didn't vanish. They were absorbed, hidden, relabeled. Black families stayed in Europe under new names, new religions, new identities. The bloodlines didn't disappear. The records did. That's why Black presence keeps showing up where it's not supposed to be. Medieval paintings, church records, noble lineages with inconvenient features. The resistance became survival through camouflage, because staying visible meant elimination. So African influence moved underground, into culture, language, craftsmanship, and genetics. Quiet continuity instead of open rule. And here's the uncomfortable part. Europe knows this. That's why Blackness in Europe is always framed as recent, modern, imported, never indigenous, never historic. Because acknowledging continuity exposes the lie that Africans were temporary guests. They weren't guests, they were rooted. And roots don't pull up clean. That's also why Europe obsessed over purity after the Moors. Blood laws, ancestry tests, religious lineage checks. The fear wasn't invasion, it was revelation. Because the longer Africans ruled Europe, the more intertwined everything became. Undoing that reality required force, and forgetting. So resistance wasn't just battles and revolts. It was endurance. It was influence surviving under new banners, knowledge surviving under new names, people surviving under new identities, and that survival still echoes, which is why this history refuses to stay buried. Because you can conquer land, but you can't conquer memory completely. And now that memory is resurfacing, not loudly, not all at once, but enough to make the official story wobble. Because once you recognize resistance didn't end, it just adapted, the narrative of total erasure collapses. And that leads to the next question they don't want asked. If African presence never fully left Europe, what else about European history isn't as exclusive as we were taught to believe? Because lies age badly. No matter how polished they are, they crack under pressure. And the story of Europe without Africa has been under pressure for a long time. Every new discovery adds weight. Every digitized manuscript widens the crack. Every restored image brings the faces back. That's why this history keeps resurfacing in waves, not because of trends, because the evidence never stopped existing. Universities are quietly revisiting old translations. Museums are adding cautious disclaimers. Language is softening. Previously believed. New interpretations. Emerging scholarship. That's not curiosity. That's damage control. Because the old certainty doesn't hold anymore. You can't keep calling Africans outsiders when the architecture says otherwise. You can't keep minimizing Moorish rule when the timelines don't bend. You can't keep praising Europe's rise without explaining the African systems underneath it. So the narrative shifts, slowly, not toward full truth, toward tolerable truth, enough to acknowledge influence, not enough to admit dependence, because dependence changes power dynamics. If Europe depended on African governance to stabilize, educate, and advance, then superiority narratives collapse, not symbolically, practically. That's why institutions prefer partial truths. They'll admit contact, they'll admit exchange, they'll admit coexistence. But rule, that's where the brakes hit, because rule implies authority. Authority implies competence. Competence implies precedent, and precedent is dangerous when exclusion is still practiced today. So the story keeps getting revised without being corrected, and people feel it. That's why so many react emotionally when this history comes up. Defensive, dismissive, angry. That's not scholarship. That's identity threat. Because if Africans ruled Europe, then the modern world is built on shared foundations, not racial hierarchies. And that idea destabilizes too many assumptions people rely on to feel secure. So the pushback isn't about facts, it's about fear. Fear of losing a story that places one group at the center and everyone else on the edges. But here's the reality they can't escape. The truth doesn't need permission to surface. It just needs time. And time is on the side of evidence, because once enough, people see the pattern: erasure, compression, rebranding, silence. The story stops feeling accidental. It feels designed, and design implies intent, which leads to the final stretch. If this history was hidden on purpose, not by accident, then uncovering it isn't optional, it's corrective, and the last question becomes unavoidable. If the past was edited to control the present, what happens to the future when people finally read the uncut version? Everything recalibrates, not emotionally, logically. Once you accept that Africans ruled Europe for centuries, modern narratives stop making sense the way they used to. The hierarchy feels forced. The assumptions feel flimsy. The confidence behind exclusion starts to look rehearsed, because history is supposed to explain the present, and the present doesn't align with a story where Africa was always behind. This is why reclaimed history doesn't just inspire pride, it sharpens perception. You start noticing how often black competence is framed as surprising, how leadership is treated as conditional, how excellence is still explained away instead of expected. That framing only works if the past supports it, and it doesn't. Once Moorish rule is acknowledged as real, long, and African, the myth of European inevitability collapses. Europe's dominance becomes situational, not destiny, contingent, not ordained. That's a dangerous shift, because if power is situational, it can change. If dominance is contingent, it can be questioned. If history isn't fixed, neither is the future. This is why reclaiming this truth isn't symbolic. It's destabilizing. It removes the psychological ceiling that says, this is as far as we go. It replaces it with precedent. And precedent is harder to argue with than hope. You don't have to imagine African governance. You've seen it. You don't have to guess whether it works. It already did. For longer than most modern ununbata than Tarchitan, states have existed. That's the quiet power of this history. It doesn't shout. It doesn't beg. It simply exists and forces everything else to justify itself, which leaves only one move left. Not denial, not distraction, not dilution, acceptance. And acceptance changes who gets to speak with authority going forward. So the final tension tightens. If acknowledging this history reshapes how power is understood, who's been relying on your ignorance to keep things exactly as they are? Here's where it ends, not with anger, with clarity. The Moors ruled Europe for 700 years. That's not opinion. That's timeline, infrastructure, governance, and consequence. Everything else, the silence, the edits, the soft language, came after. Because once that fact is accepted plainly, too many modern assumptions collapse at once about race, about leadership, about who civilization is supposed to come from. So the system does what systems always do when truth threatens: stability. It avoids the question. Instead of asking whether Africans ruled Europe, it asks how much influence they had. Instead of asking why the history was buried, it asks why people are emotional about it. Instead of addressing the erasure, it critiques the tone of those pointing it out. That's deflection, because the core question is devastatingly simple. If Africans governed Europe competently for centuries, why does black leadership still get treated like an experiment? No amount of academic gymnastics answers that cleanly, and that's why this history never gets full airtime, because teaching it completely doesn't just add information, it removes excuses. Excuses for exclusion, excuses for hierarchy, excuses for who gets trusted with power. Once precedent is restored, the burden of proof flips. Africa no longer has to prove capability. The world has to explain why that capability was ignored, and that explanation is uncomfortable. It leads to colonialism, to narrative theft, to power maintained through omission instead of merit. That's why this story was edited instead of debated, because debates can be won. Truth just waits. And now it's waiting on you, not to rage, not to posture, not to replace one myth with another, but to see clearly, to recognize that history didn't forget the Moors. It was trained not to remember them, to understand that what feels missing in the story was removed on purpose, and to stop internalizing a version of the past that was designed to shrink you. Because once you know Africans ruled Europe, not symbolically, not briefly, but structurally, you don't move the same. You question authority differently. You assess narratives more critically. You stop asking for permission to belong at the center. That's the real fear behind the silence. Not that people will feel proud, but that they'll feel unapologetically grounded. So here's the final question. Not for institutions, not for textbooks, for you. If the Moors ruled Europe for 700 years, and the only reason you weren't taught is because that truth changes how power looks, why would you ever accept a history or a future written without you at the center of it?